Well, today I want to talk about Solomon's tragic downfall and the division of the kingdom. There in 1 Kings 10, we read that King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all of the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom that God had put in his heart. You know, when you read this, you think, surely this is just going to keep going up and up and up. This is just going to continue to get better. And so we read about this great wisdom of Solomon's and just how he had the attention of the world, it seems. It's so hard to understand how such a man as Solomon could make such poor choices and leave himself unguarded so that he fell away from the Lord, at least the way that he did. He himself declares in Proverbs 1 that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. It's so tragic that the wisest man who ever lived became the most foolish man who ever lived, it seems. Now, we're told how this happened in 1 Kings 11. There we read that King Solomon loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter. Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed the Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and he did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. Now, it's important to understand that Solomon's drift was not, an overnight type thing. It was a slow and gradual drift, which he, being the wisest man to ever live, should have seen the danger of marrying foreign women. I mean, when you look through the Proverbs, look at all the warnings that he makes to young men about making sure that they guard their hearts. Now, in fact, the wisest man who ever lived ought to have heeded the words of the Lord about the dangers, but he didn't. And why is that? Now, most of Solomon's marriages were likely treaty marriages, where basically a treaty is made between himself and another nation. It says there that he had 700 wives of royal birth. So he's making treaties with other kingdoms and other nations. And part of the way the treaties work is often it involved the giving of a daughter in marriage to a king. So now we're told that he married the daughter of Pharaoh. Now, according to one resource that I consulted, the notice of a daughter of Pharaoh being married to Solomon is presented as a sign of Solomon's greatness by the authors of Kings and Chronicles. But probably it also reflects the devastated state of the Egyptian kings. So Egypt had been in many geopolitical struggles before and during Solomon's time, leaving that nation quite weak. It is possible that Pharaoh gives his daughter to Solomon in marriage as a treaty to avoid any kind of confrontation with Israel, which Egypt could not afford. Now, we don't know for sure if this was the case or if all of the marriages were marriages meant to do the same, but there's no doubt that he's being portrayed as a very great and powerful king. So put yourself in Solomon's shoes. Your greatness is unmatched by any other king. Your splendor, your success, your wisdom surpasses them all. You are feeling rather confident in yourself and likely thinking that you're above all those pitfalls that God warns about. That's for all the simple-minded folks. They're the ones that have to be really careful. But I'm the wisest of them all. So I can actually tread a little closer to that line and not fall. Well, that's probably what's happening here. That's my understanding of what's going on. Solomon became, you see, overconfident that he could keep his heart in the right place. But he was so wrong. And it came at a high cost, this error that he made. Before his death, Solomon was worshiping the gods of his foreign wives along with the Lord his God. What was once a nation devoted exclusively to one God became religiously pluralistic and syncretistic. So many gods, all they're basically the same is kind of how they saw it. All the religions really all kind of point in the same direction and lead to the same destination. Syncretistic, meaning that synchronism, they were kind of mixing and blending religions all together and so forth. The downfall of Solomon would begin a new cycle of failure and hope, much like what we see in Judges. But what can we learn from Solomon's downfall? I said in a sermon recently regarding Peter's denial of Jesus that the best of men are still men at best. And the same is true here. For all his wisdom, Solomon was still just a man. And it seems that maybe he forgot that. Maybe he lost sight of his creatureliness. And so his heart, just like the rest of us, was prone to wander, prone to leave the God that he loved. He did not heed his own wise words in Proverbs 4:23, which says, "Above all else, guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life." Don Carson, biblical scholar, writes this. He says, "What you set your mind and emotions on determines where you go and what you do. It may easily pollute all of life." What was it that Solomon set his heart on? We can only really speculate, but perhaps it started with power. It started with the influence on an international scale. Think about it. If you were seeing the possibility of the ability to, rise above all the other nations, and we're already there, and you wanted to see that influence increase, that would probably have opened the door for all sorts of pitfalls. And in this case, likely opened the door for the treaty marriages. It's possible that he wanted also to make his wives happy, and we do have some indication of that. He loved them and clinged to them. In 1 Kings tells us this. So if that's what was happening there, he wanted to make his wives happy and so forth. Perhaps what made them happy was that you let us worship our gods. Leave room for our religions, and leave room for our customs, and leave room for us to retain our identity from the nations where we came from and the religions that we follow. So he left room, he compromised. This is essentially what we see happening here. Now, what we also learn from his downfall is that as important as knowledge is, knowledge alone is not able to safeguard us from drifting away from the Lord. I remember in seminary they told us that we're studying the scriptures all the time. We're studying theology all the time, and yet we can die spiritually if we're not taking care of our spiritual lives, taking care of our hearts. That just studying these things does not mean that we are growing spiritually. And I think something similar is happening here. Certainly Solomon had lots of knowledge. God blessed him with great knowledge, and he had great wisdom. And Solomon knew all of this at the start, it seems. He knew that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. But you see, it cannot be forgotten that the fear of the Lord is also the end of knowledge. So it begins and ends with the fear of the Lord. If the knowledge does not lead to fearing him more, then it's just knowledge. It's not actually changing our lives. One of the reasons that our denomination came from, the mainline Presbyterian Church, is where the Presbyterian Church in America came from. Douglas Kelly, who teaches at RTS Charlotte, one of the things he says in one of his books is that liberalism was the result of a lost balance between head and heart. That hearts grew cold, and everything became so cerebral that they lost love for Christ, real love for Christ. It just became a matter of mental or intellectual knowledge and facts. And so what's happened then to the mainline Presbyterian Church is they've followed in Solomon's footsteps in viewing other religions as basically the same. And they compromised in all sorts of ways with all sorts of ideas and practices, including things like gay marriage and abortion, which they support. So what are some practical steps? This is for discussion. What are some practical steps that you can do as an individual to guard your heart? Think about this in terms of offense and as defense. What sort of things are necessary for doing that? So maybe look at Proverbs 4:23 and read through that section and see what the Proverbs say there. Also, the second thing, Solomon's downfall involved compromise with worldly ideas and false religions. Where do you see this happening in churches today? How can churches guard against such compromises today? Now, to help answer these questions, I would encourage you to read Jude, the book of Jude, verses 20 through 21. It's only one chapter, so it just has verses. So Jude 20 and 21 give some insight into how we can safeguard our hearts and guard against compromise. Well, bless you in your reading of God's Word.